Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who keep going when they have every reason to quit. Sometimes courage looks like a quiet woman standing in a doorway, refusing to let pain steal her dignity. In the remote mountains of Wyoming Territory, Jacob Thornhill has lived alone for 3 years, depending on his cook, Emma Dawson, to keep his homestead running. One cold November evening, she walks into his cabin with her hand badly broken and her dress torn. "They broke my hand, sir," she says simply, "but I'll keep working." Jacob has faced down grizzlies and outlaws without flinching, but her quiet strength shakes something loose inside him. What happens when a man who's forgotten how to feel meets a woman who won't stop fighting? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The homestead sat in a high valley where the wind spoke in ancient tongues and the peaks wore their snow like crowns of silver. Jacob Thornhill had built it 3 years back, choosing this spot for its isolation as much as its beauty. The cabin stood solid against the elements, constructed from pine logs he'd felled himself, chinked tight against the bitter cold that would come screaming down from the mountains each winter. Behind it, a barn housed 2 horses, a milk cow, and enough hay to see them through till spring. A root cellar dug deep into the hillside kept vegetables and preserved meat safe from freezing. Everything had its place, everything served its purpose, and nothing was wasted. Jacob was a man of 38 years who looked older in the eyes and younger in the body. Standing just over 6 feet, he carried the lean strength of someone who worked hard every day and ate simply. His hair, dark brown shot through with early grey, hung past his collar because trips to town were infrequent and vanity had died in him long ago. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, held something that made folks uncomfortable when they met his gaze too long. It was the look of a man who'd seen more than he wanted to remember and felt less than he used to feel. He rose each morning before dawn, built the fire and checked the animals. The routine never varied because routine was what kept a man sane when he lived alone with his thoughts. Or at least that's what he'd believed until Emma Dawson arrived 3 years ago, answering the advertisement he'd posted in the territorial newspaper. Cook needed for remote homestead. Must be hardy, reliable and comfortable with solitude. Emma had stepped off the supply wagon on a September afternoon, carrying one worn carpet bag and wearing a dress that had seen better days, but was clean and carefully mended. She was perhaps 30 years old, though her face held a timeless quality that made exact age difficult to guess. Tall for a woman, maybe 5.5 feet. With dark hair she wore in a simple bun and grey eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth underneath. She'd looked at the cabin, at the mountains rising behind it, at Jacob himself, and simply nodded. "Mr. Thornhill, I presume," she'd said, her voice carrying the rounded vowels of an Eastern education. "I'm here about the position." He'd meant to interview her, to ask questions about her experience and references, but something in her direct gaze stopped him. She looked like a woman who'd made hard choices and lived with them. She looked like someone who understood that sometimes you came west not to find something, but to leave something behind. "Can you cook?" he'd asked. "Yes." "Can you handle the work?" "It's demanding. The isolation gets to some people. I can handle it." He'd hired her on the spot, and in 3 years he'd never regretted it. Emma ran the household with quiet efficiency. She rose as early as he did, had coffee ready when he came in from the barn, cooked meals that were simple but nourishing, kept the cabin clean without fussing over it, and maintained a respectful distance that suited them both. They spoke when necessary, sharing information about supplies needed or work to be done, but they didn't pry into each other's private thoughts. It was an arrangement that worked, because neither of them wanted more than that, or so Jacob had believed. The truth he'd been avoiding for the past year was that Emma had become more than just his cook. She'd become the rhythm of his days, the presence that made the cabin feel less like a prison of solitude and more like a home. He noticed things about her he had no business noticing, the way she hummed quietly while kneading bread, The careful precision with which she arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table. The fact that she always saved the best piece of meat for him while taking the lesser cut for herself. He'd catch himself watching her sometimes, studying the graceful economy of her movements as she worked, wondering about the life she'd left behind in the East. Her speech and manners suggested good breeding, education, a world far removed from this rough frontier existence. What had driven a woman like that to answer an advertisement for a cook position in the middle of nowhere? What was she running from, or what had she lost? But he never asked, because asking would invite questions in return, and Jacob had built walls around his past that he had no intention of breaching. Some things were better left buried. In the pocket of his vest, he carried a gold watch that had belonged to his father. It was the only thing of value he owned, and he never opened it anymore. The inscription inside read, "To Thomas Thornhill, from your loving wife." 1845. His father had given it to him on his deathbed, and Jacob had carried it through everything that came after. His marriage, his daughter's birth, the fever that took them both. The long journey west to escape the ghosts that haunted him in Missouri. The watch no longer kept time. He'd let it wind down 2 years ago and never wound it again. Time was something he preferred not to measure too closely anymore. The homestead sat 15 miles from the nearest town, a ramshackle collection of buildings called Timber Creek that served the scattered ranches and mining operations in the territory. Once a month, Jacob made the journey to trade furs and buy supplies, and Emma would give him a carefully written list of necessities. Sometimes she'd ride along, sitting beside him on the wagon seat in companionable silence. But mostly she stayed at the homestead, preferring her solitude to the curious stares and whispered questions of the townspeople. Doc Harlan, the town's physician, was one of the few people Jacob considered something close to a friend. A man in his 60s, with kind eyes and steady hands. He'd come west after his wife died, seeking purpose in a place that needed doctors more than it needed questions about the past. He understood Jacob's need for privacy and respected it. Sheriff Bill Crenshaw was another decent man in a territory where decency was sometimes in short supply. A former cavalry officer, he'd taken the sheriff's position 5 years back and brought a measure of law to a region that had survived mostly on rough justice and the threat of the rope. He and Jacob had an understanding. Jacob stayed out of trouble, and the sheriff didn't trouble him with unnecessary visits. The nearest neighbors were the Garrett Ranch, 12 miles to the east in the lower valley. Gall Garrett ran cattle and employed a rough crew of men who came into town every Saturday to drink and cause the kind of trouble that kept Sheriff Crenshaw busy. Jacob avoided them when possible, and they returned the favor. Their worlds didn't need to intersect, but the territory was changing. More settlers arriving every year, more law, more civilization creeping into the wild spaces. Jacob wasn't sure how he felt about that. Part of him, the part that had fled Missouri, wanted things to stay unchanged, wanted the mountains to remain a fortress against the world. But another part, a part he'd thought long dead, sometimes wondered what it might be like to be part of something again, to belong to a community, to let people in. Emma seemed to bring that wondering to the surface more often lately. The way she'd smile when he brought in fresh trout from the stream, the quiet satisfaction in her voice when she remarked on a job well done, the comfortable silence they shared over supper. These small things had begun to matter to him in ways that frightened him a little. He was a man who'd lost everything once. The thought of opening himself to that kind of loss again felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one step would send him falling into darkness. So he maintained the distance, kept the walls intact, told himself this arrangement was exactly what he needed, and nothing more. On that cold November evening, when Emma walked through the door with her hand broken and her quiet declaration of determination, everything Jacob had built to protect himself would begin to crumble. But he didn't know that yet. In that moment before she arrived, he was simply a man checking his traps in the fading light, thinking about nothing more than whether they'd need more firewood for the coming storm. unaware that the storm already heading his way had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the human hearts. Stubborn refusal to stay closed forever. Jacob was skinning a rabbit when he heard the cabin door open. The light was fading fast, that peculiar purple twilight that came to the mountains in late autumn, and he'd been working quickly to finish before full dark. He had 3 good rabbits from the day's trapline, enough for several meals, and his hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done this work 1,000 times. The door shouldn't have opened. Emma always waited until he came in to start supper preparations. She had her routines just as he had his, and they rarely varied. The sound of that door, out of sequence with their usual rhythm, sent an immediate tension up his spine. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood, turning toward the cabin. Emma stood in the doorway, backlit by the lamplight from inside, and even from 30 feet away he could see something was wrong. The way she held herself, the careful stillness of her posture, the fact that she'd come outside without a shawl despite the cold, all of it spoke of distress. Jacob crossed the distance in long strides, his heart beginning to pound in a way it hadn't in years. As he drew closer, the lamplight from the cabin fell across her face, and what he saw stopped him cold. Her left cheek was swelling, the skin already darkening with the promise of a spectacular bruise. Her lip was split, a thin line of dried blood tracking down to her chin. Her hair had come loose from its usual careful bun, hanging in disarray around her shoulders. But it was her left hand that drew his eye and held it. She cradled it against her chest, and even in the dim light, he could see the unnatural angle of her fingers, the swelling that made her knuckles disappear into puffy flesh. Her dress, the simple grey cotton she wore for daily work, was torn at the shoulder. Dirt streaked the fabric, and there were what looked like boot prints on the skirt. Emma, her name came out rougher than he intended. Halfway between a question and something closer to anguish, she met his eyes, and in hers he saw pain, yes, but also something else, a fierce determination that bordered on defiance. When she spoke, her voice was steady, calm, as though she were reporting on the weather rather than her own brutalization. "They broke my hand, sir," she said simply, "but I'll keep working." The words hit him like a physical blow. The sheer courage it took to say them, the refusal to be defeated even in the face of obvious suffering, it was more than he could process in that moment. He'd faced down grizzlies in these mountains, had stared death in the face more than once, but this quiet woman's strength shook something loose inside him that he'd thought was dead and buried. Who? The word came out flat, dangerous. Who did this to you? It doesn't matter right now. I need to... It matters. He stepped closer, forcing himself to gentle his tone, even as rage built in his chest like a coming storm. Emma, please. Who did this? She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, he saw the first crack in her composure. 3 men from the Garrett Ranch. I was at the creek, filling the water buckets. They came upon me. She stopped, drew a breath. They said things, wanted things. I refused. Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The Garrett Ranch. Carl Garrett's men. He should have known. Should have anticipated. Those men came into Timber Creek every Saturday and caused trouble, pushed boundaries, thought themselves above consequence because their boss had money and influence. Did they? He couldn't finish the question, couldn't force the words past the tightness in his throat. No. Emma's voice was firm. I fought. I've always been strong, Mr. Thornhill, stronger than I look. I got away, but not before one of them, the big one with the scar on his face. He grabbed my hand and twisted until I heard it break. He laughed while he did it. The image rose unbidden in Jacob's mind, and with it came a fury so pure and cold it felt like ice in his veins. He wanted to saddle his horse right now, ride to the Garrett Ranch, and make those men understand what it meant to hurt someone under his protection. Wanted it with a violence that frightened him, because he'd worked so hard to bury that part of himself. How long ago? He asked. 2 hours, perhaps. I walked back. It's only 2 miles from the creek. 2 miles. She'd walked 2 miles with a broken hand, battered and traumatized, and the first thing she'd said to him was that she'd keep working. What kind of woman did that? What kind of strength did that require? We need to get you to Doc Harlan, Jacob said, already moving toward the barn. I'll hitch the wagon. No, Emma's voice stopped him. It's nearly dark. The trail is dangerous at night. We'll go in the morning. Emma, your hand will be just as broken in the morning as it is now. I've already splintered it as best I could. She held up her left hand, and he saw she'd wrapped it in strips of cloth torn from what looked like a spare apron, fashioning a crude but effective splint. I'm not trying to be difficult, Mr. Thornhill. I'm being practical. A nighttime journey helps no one if the wagon goes off the trail. She was right, and he hated that she was right. The trail to Timber Creek was treacherous in daylight, deadly in the dark. But every protective instinct he possessed screamed at him to do something, to fix this, to make it better somehow. All right, he said finally. But you're not working. You're going to sit down, and I'm going to bring you something for the pain, and we're going to clean those cuts properly. For a moment he thought she'd argue, but then she nodded. Thank you. They went inside together, and Jacob eased her into the chair by the fire. The cabin felt different somehow, as though what had happened to her had violated this space too, stolen some of its safety. He built up the fire while she sat in silence, then heated water and found clean cloths. He had whiskey in the cupboard, kept for medicinal purposes, and he poured her a generous measure. She drank it without complaint, though he saw her wince at the burn. Then he knelt in front of her and began the careful work of cleaning the blood from her face. She held very still while he worked, but he could feel the tremors running through her, the aftermath of shock and adrenaline beginning to set in. His hands were as gentle as he could make them, dabbing at the split lip, wiping away the blood and dirt. This close, he could smell the fierce sweat on her, mixed with the copper tang of blood and the clean scent of the soap she always used. I'm sorry, she whispered suddenly. I should have been more careful. You should have watched. Stop. The word came out harder than he intended, and he forced himself to soften it. Emma, this is not your fault. Do you hear me? Not one bit of this is your fault. But I knew they watched me sometimes when I went to town. Knew they made comments. I should have. They watched you. Jacob sat back on his heels, something cold settling in his stomach. How long has this been going on? Emma looked away, and he saw shame color her cheeks. Months, since spring at least. They'd ride past when I was working in the garden, make suggestions. Once in town, one of them cornered me outside the general store. Sheriff Crenshaw intervened, but why didn't you tell me? The question came out raw, and he saw her flinch. Because I didn't want to be trouble, she said quietly. Because I thought I could handle it. Because... She stopped, swallowed hard. Because I've learned that sometimes telling doesn't help. Sometimes it makes things worse. There was a story in those words, a history he didn't know, and it broke something in him to realize how alone she'd felt, how much she'd carried without his knowledge. He'd been so wrapped up in his own need for isolation, his own walls and protections, that he'd failed to see what was happening right in front of him. You're not trouble, he said. And he reached out slowly, carefully, and took her good hand in both of his. Emma, He stopped, searching for words that felt inadequate to the moment. You matter. What happens to you matters. To me. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw tears gathering in her grey eyes, though she didn't let them fall. Thank you, she whispered. They sat like that for a long moment, her hand in his, the fire crackling beside them, and Jacob felt the walls he'd built beginning to crack. This woman, who'd come into his life 3 years ago and made it bearable again without him even realizing it, had been hurt, had been terrorized, and he'd been too blind, too closed off to see the danger. That would change. Everything would change now. In the morning, he said quietly, we go to Doc Harlan. He'll set your hand properly. Then we're going to see Sheriff Crenshaw, and you're going to tell him everything. Every incident, every comment, every time those men made you feel unsafe. And then, Emma asked, and then I'm going to make sure they never come near you again. The promise in his voice was absolute, and he saw her recognize it for what it was, not just words, but a vow. She nodded slowly. Mr. Thornhill, Jacob, I don't want violence. I don't want you doing something that will bring the law down on you or... I know, he said. "I'll do this right, but I will do it. Those men need to understand that you're under my protection, and that means something in this territory." He helped her to her feet, and together they prepared a simple meal. Soup from the pot she'd left simmering that morning, bread from yesterday's baking. She tried to help one-handed, but he waved her back to the chair, taking over the tasks that had been hers for 3 years. It felt strange to move through her domain, to reach for things in cupboards he never opened, but he managed. They ate in silence, and afterward he insisted she take his bed while he made a pallet by the fire. She protested, but he could see the exhaustion pulling at her, the way the pain was wearing through her strength. Finally she agreed. "Good night." "Jacob," she said from the doorway to the small bedroom. "Good night, Emma," after she'd gone. Jacob sat by the fire and tried to calm the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Rage at the men who'd hurt her, guilt that he'd failed to protect her, fear at how easily he could have lost her. Because if those men had done more than break her hand, if they'd taken her life or her dignity in ways worse than what had happened, he'd have killed them. Would have ridden to that ranch and painted it red with their blood. Consequences be damned. The realization should have frightened him. For 3 years, he'd worked to bury the violent man he'd been, to find peace in isolation and routine. But tonight, that man was back, demanding justice, demanding protection for something, someone that mattered. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his father's watch. The gold caught the firelight, and for the first time in 2 years, he opened it. Inside, his father's face looked back at him from a small daguerreotype, forever frozen at age 40. Beside it, the inscription, "To Thomas Thornhill from your loving wife, 1845. His father had been a man who protected his family, who stood up for what was right, even when it cost him. Jacob had tried to be that man once, but then he'd lost everything, and being that man had seemed pointless in a world where protection meant nothing against fever and death. But Emma had brought him back. Her courage, her quiet strength, her refusal to break even when her bones did. She'd reminded him what it meant to care about someone, to want to be worthy of someone's trust. He wound the watch carefully, hearing the familiar ticking start up again after 2 years of silence. Time moving forward. Life continuing. Change coming whether he wanted it or not. Tomorrow they'd go to town. Tomorrow he'd set things in motion that couldn't be undone. But tonight he'd sit here and keep watch, making sure Emma could rest safely, knowing that he'd never again take for granted the gift of her presence in his life. The fire burned low, and Jacob Thornhill sat in the darkness, listening to the watch tick and the mountains whisper outside, and felt the ice around his heart begin. Finally, to Thor, dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning where every breath crystallized in the air, and the mountains stood sharp against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Jacob had been awake for hours, stoking the fire and watching the door to the bedroom, listening for any sound that might indicate Emma needed help. When she finally emerged, he was startled by the extent of the bruising. In the harsh morning light, her face showed the full impact of yesterday's violence. Her cheek had turned deep purple, the swelling making one eye nearly shut. Her lip looked worse than it had the night before, crusted with dried blood where the split had reopened during the night. But she was dressed, her hair carefully pinned back, despite having only one working hand, and she moved toward the stove with clear intent. "No," Jacob said, intercepting her. "You sit. I'll handle breakfast. Mr. Thornhill, I'm perfectly capable." "I know you are." He guided her gently but firmly to the chair. "But you're going to let me do this anyway." For a moment their eyes met, and he saw her wrestling with pride and practicality. Pride lost. She sat. Jacob had never been much of a cook, but he knew the basics. He made coffee strong enough to strip paint, fried bacon and eggs, sliced bread. The movements felt awkward, and he caught himself reaching for things in the wrong places, forgetting where Emma kept the salt or the butter. She watched him from the chair, and once or twice he thought he saw the ghost of a smile on her battered face. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence than they'd shared before. More weighted somehow, more aware. Jacob found himself hyper-conscious of every move she made. the careful way she held her cup with her good hand, the small grimace when she tried to open her mouth wide enough to take a bite, the exhaustion that seemed to settle around her like a cloak despite the night's rest. After breakfast, he hitched the wagon while Emma gathered a shawl and her good bonnet. The ride to Timber Creek took 2 hours over rough trail, and Jacob drove carefully, avoiding the worst of the ruts that would jostle her injured hand. She sat beside him on the bench, not speaking, her eyes on the passing landscape. Halfway there, she broke the silence. "I need to tell you something about those men. About why they—" She started again. "The big one, the one with the scar. His name is Reese McGraw. He asked me questions once, back in spring. Strange questions." Jacob kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but listened intently. He wanted to know where I was from. Not just generally, but specifically. What city, what part of the city? He asked if I'd ever lived in Boston. She paused. I told him no, but he kept pressing. It felt wrong, like he wasn't just making conversation. Like he was looking for something. "Did you live in Boston?" Jacob asked carefully. A long silence. Then yes, a long time ago. And these questions, did they stop? No. Over the summer, different men from the ranch would find ways to talk to me, always asking about the East, about where I'd been, who I knew. I started avoiding town when I could, but she gestured at her hand. Yesterday wasn't random, Jacob. I think they've been building toward something. The implications settled in his gut like cold stone. This wasn't just frontier roughness, men pushing boundaries because they could. This was targeted, purposeful. Someone was looking for information about Emma, and the Garrett men were doing the looking. Why would they care about your past? He asked. I don't know, Emma said, but something in her voice suggested she was lying. She knew, or at least suspected, and the fear in that knowledge was palpable. Jacob wanted to push, to demand answers, but he'd learned patience in these mountains. People revealed their truths in their own time, and Emma had earned the right to her secrets until she was ready to share them. Instead, he said, when we talk to the sheriff, you should mention this. All of it. She nodded. Doc Harlan's office sat above the general store, a neat room that smelled of carbolic and the herbs he used for medicines. The old physician took one look at Emma's face and hand and ushered them inside with the gentle efficiency of a man who'd seen every kind of injury the frontier could inflict. Let's have a look at that hand. My dear, he said, helping Emma to a chair by the window where the light was best. Jacob stood back while Doc Harlan carefully unwrapped the makeshift splint Emma had fashioned. He was gentle, but Jacob saw her go pale, saw her bite down on her already injured lip to keep from crying out. The hand looked worse in daylight, swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the fingers bent at angles nature never intended. 3 breaks that I can feel, Doc Harlan said quietly. 2 fingers and the bone across the back of the hand. You did well with this splint, Emma, but we need to set these properly, or they'll heal crooked and you'll lose function. Do what you need to do, Emma said. Her voice steady, despite the pain Jacob could see in her eyes. Doc Harlan looked at Jacob. This is going to hurt her considerably. I can give her laudanum, but she'll need someone to hold her steady while I work. You up for that? Jacob moved to stand behind Emma's chair, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. I'm here. The next 15 minutes were among the worst of Jacob's life. Doc Harlan worked with skill and speed, but setting broken bones was brutal work. Emma made almost no sound, just a few sharp intakes of breath and one low moan when the doctor manipulated the worst of the breaks. But Jacob felt every tremor that ran through her body, felt the way she tensed and tried not to pull away from the necessary pain. He found himself talking to her in a low voice, hardly aware of what he was saying, telling her about the first winter in the cabin, about a coyote he'd befriended that used to sit outside the door every evening. Anything to give her something to focus on besides what was happening to her hand. Finally, Doc Harlan sat back. There, best I can do. He'll need to stay splintered for 6 weeks minimum, maybe 8. No heavy use, no getting it wet, no. He looked at Emma with kind but firm eyes. No cooking, no washing, no housework. You understand me, young lady? This hand needs time to heal properly. I understand, Emma said. But Jacob could hear the protest in her voice, the automatic resistance to being told she couldn't work. I mean it, Doc Harlan pressed. If you use this hand before it's ready, it won't heal right. You'll be in pain for the rest of your life, and you'll lose fine motor control. Is that what you want? No, sir. Good. He wrapped the hand in clean white bandages, securing a proper splint that would hold the bones in place. Then he turned his attention to her face, cleaning the split lip and the various scrapes with gentle touches. These will heal on their own, but you'll have a spectacular bruise for a week or two. Nothing to be done about that except time. He gave her a packet of willow bark powder for the pain and instructions on keeping the splint dry and clean. Then he walked them to the door, and as Emma descended the stairs ahead of them, he caught Jacob's arm. I've known you 3 years. Jacob Thornhill, the old doctor said quietly. And in all that time you've been a ghost of a man, walking, talking, breathing, but not really living. I see something different in your eyes today. Jacob didn't know what to say to that. That woman down there, Doc Harlan continued, nodding toward Emma, she's special. I've seen it since the day she arrived in this territory. Strong in ways that have nothing to do with muscles. Good in ways that are rare out here. If you've finally noticed that, I'm glad. But Jacob, the old man's grip tightened. Don't let fear keep you alone forever. We're not promised tomorrow in this life. You learned that the hard way once. Don't let that lesson make you waste what time you do have. The words hit harder than Jacob wanted to admit. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and followed Emma down the stairs. Sheriff Bill Crenshaw's office was a short walk from Doc Harlan's place, a sturdy building with bars on one window, where he kept the occasional drunk or troublemaker overnight. The sheriff was at his desk when they entered, a big man with a weathered face and honest eyes that had seen too much of humanity's dark side. He took one look at Emma and stood. Mrs. Dawson, what happened? Emma told the story again, her voice calm and factual, but Jacob watched the sheriff's expression harden with each detail. When she got to the part about Reese McGraw breaking her hand deliberately, Crenshaw's jaw clenched. I'll ride out to the Garrett Ranch today, he said. Have a talk with Carl and his men. It won't do any good, Emma said quietly. They'll deny it. Say I fell or hurt myself some other way. It'll be my word against theirs. Maybe so, Crenshaw said, but they'll know I'm watching. Sometimes that's enough to make men think twice. He looked at Jacob. You planning on taking matters into your own hands? It was a fair question. Jacob met the sheriff's eyes steadily. I'm planning on making sure Emma is safe. Whatever that takes. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I've got right now, Jacob said. But I give you my word. I'll try to do this within the law. Try being the operative word. Crenshaw studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. But Jacob, if you go after those men, even if they deserve it, I'll have to bring you in. Law's the law. I understand. They left the sheriff's office and walked back to the wagon. Emma was quiet, and Jacob could see the morning had drained her. The trip, the pain of having her hand set, the reliving of yesterday's trauma, it had all taken its toll. On the ride home, she dozed against his shoulder, and Jacob drove slowly, letting the horses pick their way carefully over the rough spots. The weight of her, trusting him enough to sleep despite her pain, felt both precious and terrifying. He'd forgotten what it was like to have someone depend on him, to matter to someone beyond the practical considerations of employment and mutual survival. His rifle, Old Thunder, lay in the wagon bed behind them. He'd carried it for 15 years, through more situations than he cared to remember. It was a weapon that had never failed him, and right now its presence was a comfort. Because despite what he'd told the sheriff, despite his promise to try to work within the law, Jacob Thornhill knew something with absolute certainty. If those men came near Emma again, Old Thunder would speak for him. And this time, there would be no holding back. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm, strange but not unpleasant. Emma tried to maintain her usual routines one-handed, but Jacob intercepted her at every turn, taking over the heavy work. The tasks that required 2 functional hands, the lifting and carrying that would stress her injury. At first, she resisted. Old habits died hard, and her identity had been built on competence and self-sufficiency. But gradually, she began to accept his help, even to anticipate it. They fell into an unconscious partnership. moving around each other in the cabin's small space with an awareness that felt both natural and charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Jacob found himself in the kitchen more than he'd ever been, learning the rhythm of her recipes, the preferences she'd developed over 3 years of cooking for him. She'd sit at the table, guiding him through the steps, her voice patient even when he fumbled. "Not so much salt," she'd say, watching him prepare a stew. "And the meat needs to brown first, before you add the liquid. I thought you just threw it all in a pot," Jacob admitted, stirring awkwardly. "That's why your cooking tastes like boot leather," Emma said. And there was the ghost of a smile on her face, the first real smile since the attack. The sound of her gentle teasing unlocked something in him. He found himself wanting to make her smile more, to see that lightness return to her eyes. So he deliberately made mistakes, played up his incompetence more than was strictly honest, just to hear her laugh and correct him. One evening, as they worked side by side preparing supper, him chopping vegetables with exaggerated clumsiness, her directing from her chair, she said something that changed the air between them. "You're a good man." Jacob Thornhill, he stopped mid-chop, looking at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because you could have ignored what happened to me, could have told me it was my problem to solve. But instead, you've rearranged your whole life to help me heal." "Not many men would do that." Jacob set down the knife carefully. "Emma, you keep my home running. You've made this place bearable for 3 years. Of course I'd help you. It's more than duty," she said quietly. "I can see that, feel it. And I want you to know, it matters. You matter." The echo of his own words from that first terrible night hung between them. Jacob found his throat tight, words inadequate to what he was feeling. So instead, he did something he'd never done before. He crossed to where she sat, knelt beside her chair, and took her good hand gently in both of his. "Tell me about Boston," he said. "Tell me why those men were asking questions. Tell me what you're afraid of." Emma's eyes widened, and for a moment he thought she'd retreat into the careful walls they'd both maintained for 3 years. But then something in her seemed to give way, a dam breaking after holding back too much for too long. "I came from a good family," she began, her voice soft. "My father was a merchant, successful and respected. He wanted to arrange a marriage for me to a business associate's son. It was how things were done in our circle. Practical, sensible, beneficial to both families." She paused, and Jacob waited, his thumb unconsciously stroking the back of her hand. "The man was 20 years older than me. He had a wife who died. Some said from an accident, others whispered different stories. He had money, position, all the things my father valued. But when I met him, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. A coldness, a sense that he viewed everything, everyone, as possessions to be acquired and controlled. "So you ran," Jacob said. "I ran. I took what money I'd saved from my mother's inheritance, bought passage on a coach heading west, and never looked back. That was 7 years ago. I've moved several times, always staying ahead of anyone who might recognize me, might send word back to Boston. Because my father," her voice caught, "my father swore he'd find me, make me honor the arrangement. Said I'd brought shame on the family by refusing. 7 years. She'd been running for 7 years, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid. The weight of that kind of fear, that kind of isolation, suddenly reframed everything Jacob knew about her. Her reserve, her reluctance to go into town, her careful maintenance of distance. It had all been self-protection. And you think these men, the Garrett ranch hands, they might be, what, looking for you? Sent by your father? "I don't know," Emma admitted. "It might be nothing, might be coincidence, but those questions, the way they asked them, it felt deliberate, like someone had given them information to verify." Jacob was silent for a moment, processing this. Then he said, "You had a child. You mentioned it that day at the creek." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, not from the arranged marriage. I never married him. But there was someone before I ran. A brief, foolish romance with a young man who promised me everything and delivered nothing but heartbreak. When I discovered I was carrying his child, he disappeared, claimed it wasn't his. I was 17, alone, desperate, and the baby, stillborn, a girl. I held her for an hour, then watched them take her away to bury in a pauper's grave because I had no money for anything better. That's when I decided to run west. There was nothing left for me there except shame and broken dreams. Jacob felt his heart breaking for her, for all she'd endured, all she'd survived. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I'm sorry for all of it. You deserved better. We all deserve better than what life gives us sometimes, Emma said. You lost your wife and daughter. I know that. I see it in your eyes sometimes, the grief that never quite leaves. It was his turn to share, and fair turnabout. Margaret and Sarah. My wife was 26, my daughter was 4. The fever took them both in the same week. I held them while they burned, helpless to do anything but watch them slip away. Margaret went first, and Sarah kept asking for her mama, not understanding why she wouldn't wake up. Then Sarah, he had to stop, breathe through the pain that never fully subsided. She died in my arms, calling for her mother. I buried them side by side in Missouri and came west because I couldn't bear to live in that house anymore. Couldn't bear the memories, and now you live here, alone with different memories, Emma said softly. Not alone anymore, Jacob said, and the truth of it surprised him. Not since you came. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped, two broken people finding unexpected comfort in shared honesty. Outside, the wind picked up, making the cabin walls creak. But inside there was warmth, light, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find again. Jacob, Emma said finally, if those men come back, if my past catches up with me, I don't want you caught in the crossfire. You've already lost so much. So have you, Jacob replied. And I'm not letting you face it alone. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. That's not negotiable. She smiled at that. A real smile this time, despite the fading bruises on her face. Stubborn mountain man, stubborn Boston lady, he countered. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Jacob sat by the fire with his mother's recipe book in his hands. Emma had left it on the table, marked to a page for apple cake. The handwriting was elegant, cultured, evidence of the education and refinement she'd mentioned. In the margins, someone had added notes in Emma's hand. Adjustments for high-altitude baking, substitutions when certain ingredients weren't available, small innovations born of frontier necessity. The book was a bridge between her past and present, between the life she'd fled and the life she'd built here. It represented her ability to take what was good from her history and adapt it to new circumstances, to honor her mother's memory while forging her own path. Jacob understood that impulse. His father's watch in his pocket, Sarah's doll on the shelf. These were his bridges, his connections to a past he couldn't change, but could choose to carry forward with grace. Instead of only grief, he opened the recipe book to a random page and found a cake recipe titled Mother's Sunday Best. Below it, in Emma's handwriting, she'd written, "Made this for Mr. Thornhill's birthday, though he didn't know it was his birthday." He ate 3 pieces and said it was the finest cake he'd ever tasted. Some days the small victories are enough, his birthday. Jacob had to think for a moment to even remember when that was. April 12th. She'd baked him a cake 6 months ago and never said a word about the occasion. Just put it on the table and let him enjoy it, not making a fuss, respecting his grief-driven need to let such markers pass unacknowledged. But she'd known. She'd cared enough to mark the day in her own quiet way. Jacob closed the recipe book carefully and set it on the shelf where she kept it. Tomorrow he'd tell her he'd seen her note. Tomorrow he'd thank her for caring when he'd been too lost in his own pain to notice. Tomorrow they'd continue building this unexpected thing between them. This partnership that was becoming something more, something that might eventually be called love, if they were both brave enough to claim it. But tonight, he'd sit here and let himself feel grateful. Grateful that she'd come into his life. Grateful that she'd stayed. Grateful that despite everything, her fear, his grief, the violence that had brought them to this moment, they'd both found the courage to begin opening their hearts again. 2 weeks passed, and autumn deepened toward winter. The aspens on the mountainside turned gold, then lost their leaves in a few wind-swept days, leaving the slopes looking bare and expectant. Jacob spent his mornings cutting firewood, stacking it high against the coming cold, while Emma sat on the porch when the weather allowed, directing his work with gentle commentary that made him smile. Her hand was healing. Doc Harlan had confirmed on their second visit to town. The swelling had gone down, and though she couldn't use it yet, the bones were knitting properly. The bruises on her face had faded through spectacular colors, purple to green to yellow, before finally disappearing, leaving her looking like herself again, though Jacob thought he saw something new in her eyes. A softness when she looked at him, and awareness that matched his own. They'd fallen into patterns of casual touch that would have been unthinkable a month ago. His hand on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, her fingers trailing across his arm when she wanted his attention. Small intimacies that spoke of growing trust, and something deeper neither of them had quite named yet. It was on a crisp morning, the air sharp with the promise of the first snow, that Jacob decided to make her something. He'd been thinking about it for days, ever since watching her struggle to hold a spoon with her splinted hand. The frustration evident in the set of her shoulders, even when she said, "Nothing." He took a piece of birch. Wood from his carefully hoarded supply, wood he'd been saving for something special, though he hadn't known what, and began to carve. His hands remembered the skill from childhood, when his father had taught him to shape wood with patience and care. The knife moved surely, peeling away thin curls of pale wood, revealing the form hidden inside. It took him 3 days, working in the barn where Emma wouldn't see, stealing hours between his regular chores. He carved a spoon with a handle shaped to fit her right hand perfectly, with a gentle curve that would distribute the weight naturally, making it easier to use one-handed. He sanded it smooth as silk, then rubbed it with beeswax until it glowed honey gold in the lamplight. On the 4th morning, he presented it to her at breakfast. Emma took the spoon with her good hand, turning it over, examining every detail. Her eyes grew bright with unshed tears, and when she looked up at him, the emotion in her face made his breath catch. "You made this," she said, her voice rough. "For me?" Seemed practical, Jacob said, uncomfortable with the intensity of her reaction, but pleased by it too. "Your hand being hurt and all." Jacob Thornhill. "This is the most thoughtful gift anyone has ever given me." She stood, walked around the table, and did something that shocked them both. She kissed him on the cheek. Just a soft press of lips against the weathered skin, but it sent lightning through his entire body. They stood frozen for a moment, both aware they'd crossed some invisible line, both uncertain what came next. Then Emma stepped back, the spoon clutched to her chest, her cheeks flushed. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome," he managed. The kiss, innocent as it was, changed things between them. The air felt charged now, heavy with possibility, and the weight of decisions neither of them was quite ready to make. But it was a good tension, Jacob thought. The kind that came from wanting something and knowing the other person wanted it too, even if fear and caution kept you both from acting on it yet. That afternoon, Doc Harlan made an unexpected visit, riding up the trail on his old mare, with his medical bag strapped behind the saddle. Jacob met him at the barn, surprised but pleased to see the old physician. "Everything all right with Emma's hand?" Jacob asked as they walked toward the cabin. "That's not why I'm here," Doc Harlan said, his expression serious. "Jacob, I need to talk to you and Emma both. Something's happened in town." They settled around the table, Emma serving coffee with her good hand, while Jacob waited with growing unease for the doctor to explain. "Carl Garrett came to see me 2 days ago," Doc Harlan began. "Had one of his men with him, fellow named Reese McGraw, the same one who broke Emma's hand." Jacob's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, waiting. "McGraw had been shot," Doc Harlan continued. "Flesh wound in the shoulder, nothing fatal, but he was bleeding considerable. Garrett claimed it was a hunting accident, but—" The old doctor shook his head. "I've patched up enough gunshot wounds to know the difference between a hunting rifle and a pistol. This was pistol work, close range. Someone shot McGraw deliberately. The sheriff know about this?" Jacob asked. "He does now. I sent word after they left. But here's the thing that troubles me, Jacob. Before I sedated McGraw to clean the wound, he was ranting. Fevered talk, mostly, but he kept saying something about how the Boston woman would pay, and that they'd been patient long enough. But now there were new orders. Emma's face had gone pale. Jacob reached across the table and took her hand. New orders from whom? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say. Got quiet after that, and when he woke up he wouldn't talk at all. Just stared at me with eyes full of hate. Doc Harlan looked at Emma with concern. My dear, I don't know what these men want with you, but it's clear their interest goes beyond frontier roughness. There's something deliberate happening here, and I thought you should know. Who shot McGraw? Jacob asked. Any idea? Sheriff's investigating. But between you and me, I'd wager it was someone from town. There's been talk since what happened to Emma. Folks aren't happy about Garrett's men, thinking they can brutalize women and get away with it. Someone might have decided to deliver a message of their own. After Doc Harlan left, with promises to keep them informed of any further developments, Jacob and Emma sat in heavy silence. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting gold stripes across the worn floorboards. They're not going to stop, Emma said finally. Whatever they want, whoever sent them, they're committed now. And I've brought this to your door, Jacob. I should leave. Should move on before— No. The word came out hard, absolute. Jacob stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair, just as he had that first terrible night. Emma, we've had this conversation. You're not leaving. You're not running anymore. But you could be hurt, killed, all because of me, because of choices I made years ago. Choices? Jacob took both her hands in his, careful of the splintered one. You chose to escape an unwanted marriage. You chose to build a life on your own terms. You chose honesty over comfort and freedom over security. Those aren't crimes, Emma. Those are the decisions of a brave woman. They don't feel brave, she whispered. They feel like mistakes that keep catching up with me. Then we'll face them. Together. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his father's watch, opening it to show her the inscription and the daguerreotype. This was my father's. He gave it to me before he died, and I carried it through everything. My marriage, Sarah's birth, the fever that took them. For 2 years after I came here, I let it wind down. Stopped time because I couldn't bear to let it keep moving forward without them. Emma looked at the watch, then at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. But I wound it again. Jacob continued. The night you came home hurt. I wound it because I realized something. Time moves forward whether we're ready or not, and we can choose to let it pass us by, to stay frozen in our pain and fear, or we can choose to live in the time we're given, to find meaning, connection, maybe even love again. Love, Emma repeated softly. I'm not good with words, Jacob said, his voice rough. Never have been. But Emma, these past weeks with you, taking care of you, talking with you, learning who you really are, beyond the capable woman who keeps my house. It's woken something in me I thought was dead. I care about you, more than I have any right to, more than is probably wise, but there it is. I care what happens to you. I care that you're happy, that you're safe, that you stay. Tears spilled down Emma's cheeks, but she was smiling. I care about you too, she whispered. So much it frightens me. I came here thinking I'd just hide, just exist, until time or trouble caught up with me. But you made me want to live again, made me believe I deserved more than just survival. Jacob reached up and gently wiped the tears from her face. Then live, here with me. Let me stand beside you when trouble comes. Let me be the partner you deserve. Emma leaned forward, and this time when their lips met, it was no chaste kiss on the cheek. It was tentative at first. Testing, tasting, two people who'd been alone too long, suddenly finding connection in the simplest and most profound way. Then it deepened, became something more urgent, more honest. 3 years of careful distance collapsing into desperate closeness. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. I don't know what tomorrow brings, he said. Don't know what these men want or how we'll stop them. But I know I want to face it with you. Together, Emma agreed. That night they talked until the fire burned low, sharing stories they'd kept locked away. Jacob told her about Sarah's favorite doll, about the way she'd laugh when he'd chase her around the yard, about Margaret's patience with his rough ways and her ability to find joy in simple things. Emma told him about her mother's kindness, about the books she'd loved as a girl, about the dreams she'd had before circumstances forced her to set them aside. They spoke of the future too, carefully testing the boundaries of what might be possible. A partnership that was more than employer and employee. A life built on honesty and mutual respect. Maybe eventually something that looked like family. "I never thought I'd want this again," Jacob admitted as the night deepened. "After losing Margaret and Sarah, I was convinced that loving people only meant losing them, that the pain wasn't worth the joy. And now?" Emma asked. "Now I think maybe the joy is what makes us human. That loving despite the risk of loss is the bravest thing we can do." He took her hand. "You showed me that, Emma. Your courage, your refusal to let pain break you. You reminded me what it means to keep living even when life has been hard." Emma squeezed his hand. "We'll teach each other," she said. "How to be brave, how to trust, how to build something good from broken pieces." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves. The first snow of the season was coming. Jacob could feel it in the air. Winter would be here soon, bringing its own challenges and hardships. But inside the cabin, there was warmth and light, and the beginning of something that felt like hope. Tomorrow, they'd prepare for whatever was coming. Tonight, they'd simply be two people who'd found each other in the wilderness, who'd chosen connection over isolation, who'd decided that love, even with all its risks and complications, was worth reaching for again. 3 days after the first snow, a supply rider brought mail to the homestead, an unusual occurrence since Jacob rarely received correspondence. The young man, a fellow named Tommy who worked for the postal office in Timber Creek, looked nervous as he handed over a single envelope. "This came on yesterday's coach," Tommy said, his eyes darting between Jacob and Emma. "Sheriff Crenshaw said to bring it out personal-like, not wait for your monthly supply run. Said it was important. The envelope was heavy paper, expensive, with Emma's name written in an elegant hand. No return address, but the postmark was from Denver, dated 2 weeks prior." Emma's face went white as she took it, and Jacob saw her hands trembling. After Tommy left, declining their offer of coffee in his haste to get back to town before dark, Emma stood staring at the envelope as though it might contain a snake. "You want me to open it?" Jacob asked gently. Emma shook her head. "No, I need to do this." She broke the seal with her good hand and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. As she read, Jacob watched her face cycle through shock, fear, and finally something that looked like weary resignation. "It's from a federal marshal," she said quietly. "A man named William Garrett. He says—" Her voice broke, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. "He says he's been protecting me for 2 years, ever since I testified in a federal case against Vincent Carmichael." Jacob took the letter she handed him, reading quickly. The marshal's words were formal but clear. Emma had witnessed a murder in Boston 4 years ago. She'd seen Vincent Carmichael kill a business rival in what was staged to look like a robbery. Initially too frightened to come forward, she'd eventually contacted the federal authorities and agreed to testify in exchange for protection and a new identity. The trial had concluded 6 months ago with Carmichael's conviction on multiple charges, including murder, fraud, and racketeering. He'd been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, but 3 weeks ago he'd been released on a legal technicality, a procedural error that invalidated the conviction. Within days of his release, the marshal's letter continued, Carmichael began liquidating assets and calling in favors from his extensive network. "We have credible intelligence that he's hired men to locate you, Miss Dawson, and we believe he intends not simply to silence you, but to make an example of you, to demonstrate what happens to those who testify against him. You are in grave danger. I urge you to leave your current location immediately and contact me at the address below for relocation to a safer territory." Jacob set the letter down carefully, his mind reeling. This changed everything. Emma hadn't been running from an arranged marriage, or rather, that had been only part of the truth. She'd been running from a murderer, a man powerful enough to beat a federal conviction, a man with resources to track her across the country. "You testified against a killer," Jacob said slowly. "You put him in prison, and now he's free, and he's coming for you." Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't tell you because I was ashamed. Because I thought if you knew the truth, that I'd been that foolish, that blind about who Carmichael really was, you'd see me differently. See me as weak or stupid or—" "Stop!" Jacob crossed to her, taking her face gently in his hands. "Emma, you saw a murder and had the courage to testify. Do you understand how rare that is? How many people would have stayed silent out of fear? You did the right thing, the brave thing, and now you're being punished for it. That's not weakness. That's not foolishness. That's—" He had to stop, his throat tight with emotion. "That's heroism." "It doesn't feel heroic," Emma whispered. "It feels like I've condemned us both." "No," Jacob said firmly. "Carmichael condemned himself when he chose to kill. You just made sure he faced consequences. And if he's coming for you now, he'll have to go through me first." Emma pulled back, looking at him with anguish. "Jacob, you don't understand what kind of man he is. He has money, connections, people who'll do anything he asks. The men from the Garrett Ranch, they're probably just the first wave, testing your defenses, gathering information. When Carmichael himself comes, or sends his real professionals, then we'll be ready," Jacob interrupted. But even as he said it, doubt crept in. He'd faced dangers in his time, hostile tribes, wild animals, desperate men. But this was different. This was organized, methodical, backed by resources he couldn't match. How did you defend against someone who could buy an army? The answer came to him slowly, a memory from his army days surfacing. You didn't fight a larger force head-on. You used terrain, preparation, and the element of surprise. You made them come to you on your ground, where you held the advantage. "We need help," Emma said, as though reading his thoughts. "We need the law, The law couldn't keep Carmichael in prison," Jacob reminded her gently. "A technicality set him free. What makes you think the law can protect you now? Then what do we do?" Emma's voice was small, frightened, and it broke his heart. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he said, "We go to town tomorrow. We talk to Sheriff Crenshaw, show him this letter. We talk to Doc Harlan, Mrs. Henderson, people we trust. We let them know what's coming. And then," he took a deep breath, "and then we prepare this place like the fortress it was meant to be. We lay in supplies, set up defenses, and we wait. Because, Emma, running isn't going to save you. Carmichael's proved he can find you anywhere. Better to make a stand here, where I know every rock and tree, where I can control the approach, where we have friends nearby who can support us." "You're talking about a siege," Emma said. "About waiting for them to come." "I'm talking about survival," Jacob corrected. "About using every advantage we have. They'll expect you to run, to hide. They won't expect you to stand and fight." Emma was silent, processing this. Then she said, "The letter mentions the Garrett Ranch. Says the marshal investigated after Doc Harlan reported the suspicious gunshot wound. 2 of Garrett's men have disappeared, left suddenly without collecting their pay. The marshal thinks they were scouts sent by Carmichael, and once they confirmed my location, they moved on to report back." "How long?" Jacob asked. "How long do we have?" "The marshal estimates 2 weeks, perhaps 3. Time for the message to reach Carmichael, for him to organize his men, for them to travel here." "But Jacob," Emma gripped his arm. "He says Carmichael won't come himself. He'll send professionals, men who kill for money, who are good at it. Men who won't hesitate, won't be swayed by conscience or law. 2 weeks, maybe 3. It wasn't much time, but it was something." Jacob's mind began working through logistics, supplies they'd need, defensive positions to prepare, contingencies to plan for. He'd done this before, in different circumstances, but with the same stakes. Life or death, survival or defeat. "There's something else," Emma said, pulling another piece of paper from the envelope. The marshal included this. "It's my real testimony, the full account of what I saw that night. He says I should read it, remember it, because if I survive this, if we survive, I'll need to testify again when they retry Carmichael. My testimony is the key evidence. Without me, he walks free permanently." Jacob took the document, scanning it quickly. Emma's words, transcribed in official legal language, describing how she'd seen Vincent Carmichael strangle a man named Robert Hayes in an alley behind a Boston warehouse. How she'd been there by accident, taking a shortcut home from a friend's house. How Carmichael had looked up and seen her, how she'd run, how he'd sent men to find her, but she'd disappeared into the city's poor districts before they could, how she'd lived in terror for months before finally finding the courage to contact the authorities, how they'd placed her in protective custody, given her a new name, sent her west to testify from safety, how she'd been promised protection that had now clearly failed. "You've been living with this fear for 2 years," Jacob said, understanding flooding through him. "Every day wondering if today would be the day they found you." "Yes," Emma whispered. "And now they have." Jacob set the papers aside and pulled Emma into his arms, holding her tightly. "Listen to me," he said against her hair. "You are not alone anymore. You have me. You have friends in town. You have people who care whether you live or die. And Emma," he pulled back to look into her eyes, "you have the truth on your side. Carmichael is a murderer, and the world needs to know it. Needs you to survive to testify again. So we're not just fighting for your life. We're fighting for justice." "I'm so afraid," Emma admitted, her voice breaking. "Afraid they'll hurt you. Afraid I'll lose you the way I've lost everyone else. Afraid that even if we survive, you'll resent me for bringing this storm to your door." "Never," Jacob said fiercely. "Emma, whatever happens, whatever comes, I'm with you by choice. Because you matter to me. Because what we've found together is worth fighting for. Because—" He stopped, searching for words adequate to what he felt. "Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, honest and irrevocable. Emma's eyes widened, tears spilling over. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been trying not to, trying to protect us both from more pain, but I can't help it. I love you, Jacob Thornhill, and I'm terrified that love is going to get you killed. Or it might save us both," Jacob countered. He kissed her softly, tasting salt from her tears. "Love makes us fight harder, makes us smarter, makes us unwilling to surrender. Love is not our weakness, Emma. It's our strength." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet cabin, while snow fell outside and time ticked forward on the watch in Jacob's pocket. Tomorrow they'd begin preparations in earnest. Tomorrow they'd face the reality of what was coming. But tonight they had this moment of honesty, this declaration of feeling, this choice to stand together despite impossible odds. 2 weeks, Emma said finally, pulling back. "What can we accomplish in 2 weeks?" Jacob's smile was grim but determined. "More than Carmichael expects. More than any city killer is prepared for. Emma, they're coming to my territory now. They're facing a man who's survived in these mountains for 3 years, who knows every approach and escape route, who has nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." He touched her face gently. "They think they're hunting a frightened woman and an isolated mountain man. They don't know they're walking into a trap set by someone who's been preparing for this fight his whole life, even if he didn't know it until now." Emma searched his face, seeing the determination there, the cold calculation of a former soldier assessing the battlefield. "Promise me something," she said. "Promise me you won't die for me. That if it comes down to it, you'll save yourself." "I can't promise that," Jacob said honestly. "But I can promise I'll fight like hell to keep us both alive." "That's good enough." Emma managed a small smile through her tears. "It'll have to be." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brilliant winter day that made the snow-covered mountains gleam like diamonds. Jacob and Emma rode into Timber Creek together, the marshal's letter tucked safely in Jacob's coat pocket and a shared sense of purpose binding them together. Sheriff Crenshaw read the letter twice, his weathered face growing grimmer with each pass. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a mixture of anger and reluctant admiration. "Mrs. Dawson, or whatever your real name is, you've got more guts than half the men I've known," he said. "Testifying against a man like Carmichael takes the kind of courage most folks don't possess." "Her name is Emma," Jacob said quietly. "That's who she is now, and that's what matters." Crenshaw nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Emma, then?" He set the letter down. "I'll be straight with you both. My jurisdiction covers Timber Creek and the immediate territory. I can deputize a few good men, keep watch on the town. But if Carmichael's men come in force to Jacob's homestead, I won't be able to get there in time to help. It's too far, too isolated. We're not asking you to defend us, Jacob said. We're asking you to watch for strangers, to send word if you see men who don't belong, to be ready if we need backup after the fact. That I can do, Crenshaw agreed. He pulled out a map of the territory and spread it on his desk. Show me your place, Jacob. Show me the approaches. They spent an hour going over the terrain. Jacob marked the homestead's position, the trail from town, the secondary routes that someone on horseback might take. He pointed out the natural defenses, the way the cabin sat with mountains behind it, limiting approach angles. The creek that would freeze solid this time of year, creating an ice barrier on one side. The open ground in front that would leave attackers exposed. You've chosen well, Crenshaw observed. Almost like you planned for this. Old habits from army days, Jacob admitted. I always think defensively. The sheriff looked at him with new interest. How long were you in? 8 years. Scout and occasional advance reconnaissance? That explains some things about you, Crenshaw said. The way you carry yourself, the way you watch your surroundings. I'd wondered. He traced a finger along the map. If I were coming for you, I'd approach from the east, through the Garrett property. It's the longest route, but provides the most cover until the final approach. That's what I'd do too, Jacob agreed. Which is why I'll be watching that direction most carefully. After leaving the sheriff's office, they visited Doc Harlan. The old physician listened to their story with growing concern, then immediately began gathering medical supplies. You'll need bandages. Antiseptic, laudanum for pain, he said, filling a leather bag with bottles and packets. Needle and thread for stitching wounds. Willow bark powder. Everything I'd bring if I was tending battlefield casualties. Doc, we can't ask you to... Emma began. You're not asking. I'm offering. Doc Harlan's eyes were fierce. Emma, you did the right thing testifying. The world needs more people willing to stand up to men like Carmichael, not fewer. If helping you survive means packing this bag, then that's the least I can do. Their final stop was at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The elderly woman had been one of the few people in town who'd shown Emma kindness from the start, never prying into her past, never judging her reserve. When they explained the situation, she listened quietly, her lined face thoughtful. I survived something similar 40 years back, she said when they finished. Different circumstances, different man, but the same fear of someone powerful coming to do harm. I understand what you're facing. She disappeared into her private quarters and returned with an old pistol, small but well-maintained. This was my late husband's. I want you to have it, Emma. A woman should be able to defend herself. Emma took the pistol with trembling hands. Mrs. Henderson, I don't know how to... Jacob will teach you, the old woman said firmly. She looked at Jacob. You'll teach her proper, won't you? Not just how to fire, but when to fire and what comes after. I will, Jacob promised. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson caught Emma's hand. Child, listen to me. When bad men come for you, you don't give them what they want. You don't go quietly. You fight with everything you have, and you make them pay for every inch. You understand? Emma nodded, tears in her eyes. Yes, ma'am. Good. Now you two get home and get ready. And Emma, Mrs. Henderson smiled, you come back to visit when this is over. I expect to see you alive and well, you hear? I hear, Emma whispered. The ride home was quiet, both of them lost in thought. They'd told their story 3 times now, and each telling had made it more real, more immediate. This wasn't some distant threat anymore. It was coming soon, and they needed to be ready. Over the next 10 days, Jacob transformed the homestead into a fortress. He reinforced the cabin's door and shutters with extra timber, creating firing ports that would allow them to shoot out while remaining protected. He stocked the root cellar with enough supplies to last weeks if necessary. Dried meat, flour, beans, coffee, water. He showed Emma every defensive position he'd prepared, made her walk through scenarios until she could navigate the property blindfolded. Where to take cover if attackers came from the east, from the west, from multiple directions. how to reach the barn without exposing herself to fire from the main trail, how to use the root cellar's secondary exit if the cabin became untenable, and he taught her to shoot. They started with the small pistol Mrs. Henderson had given her, working on grip and stance and breathing. Emma proved a quick study, her natural precision serving her well. After 3 days, she could hit a target at 15 feet with reasonable accuracy. After a week, she rarely missed. "You're a natural," Jacob observed, watching her reload smoothly, her healed hand now strong enough to help with the mechanics of firing. "I'm motivated," Emma replied. "When the alternative is death or worse, you learn quickly." He taught her to use his rifle too, Old Thunder, the weapon that had saved his life more than once. It had more kick than the pistol, bruised her shoulder the first few times she fired it. But she persisted until she could handle it competently. "I never wanted to be someone who solved problems with violence," Emma said one evening as they cleaned the weapons together by lamplight. "I always believed in reason, in law, in civilized solutions." "So did I," Jacob said. "But Emma, sometimes civilized solutions fail. Sometimes the only thing standing between innocent people and evil is someone willing to fight. That doesn't make us bad people. It makes us realistic ones." Emma nodded slowly. "I keep thinking about that night in Boston, watching Carmichael kill Robert Hayes. I was so frightened, so convinced I'd be next if he caught me. But looking back now, I realize something. I was also angry. Angry that he thought he could take a life so casually. Angry that his money and power let him believe he was above consequences. That anger is what finally pushed me to testify." "Good," Jacob said. "Hold on to that anger. Let it make you strong when fear tries to make you weak." Doc Harlan visited twice during those 10 days, bringing more supplies and checking on their preparations. On his second visit, he pulled Jacob aside while Emma was in the barn. "Son, I've been thinking about what you're facing," the old physician said, "and I want you to have this." He pulled out a small derringer, the kind gamblers and fancy women carried for close-quarters defense. "It's not much, but if someone gets past your rifle and pistol, this gives you one more chance." Jacob took the weapon, checking it automatically. "Loaded both barrels." "Thank you, Doc. Jacob, I've lived a long time. Seen a lot of good people die because they weren't ruthless enough when they needed to be." Doc Harlan's eyes were serious. "If it comes down to it, if it's Emma's life or showing mercy to men who've come to kill her, you don't hesitate. You understand me?" "I understand," Jacob said quietly. Sheriff Crenshaw sent word on the 12th day. 3 strangers had arrived in Timber Creek the night before, asking questions about homesteads in the area, about a woman matching Emma's description. They were well-dressed, well-armed, and carried themselves like professionals. When the sheriff had tried to question them, they'd shown papers identifying them as private investigators working a missing persons case. "Legal if barely. They're scouting," Jacob said, reading the sheriff's hastily written note. "Confirming Emma's location, assessing the situation. The real attack will come after they report back." "How long?" Emma asked, her face pale but composed. "Days, maybe." "A week at most." Jacob looked at her seriously. "Emma, there's still time to run." "To take the marshal's offer, disappear into federal protection." "No," Emma interrupted firmly. "I'm done running. We stand here, together, or we don't stand at all." Jacob nodded, pride and fear warring in his chest. "Then we finish our preparations." That night Jacob pulled out his military medal and the papers that came with it. He hadn't looked at them in years, had tried to bury that part of himself along with everything else from his past. But now, spreading them on the table, he found himself remembering the tactics he'd learned, the strategies for asymmetric warfare, the methods for defending against superior numbers. He'd been decorated twice for actions in hostile territory, once for leading wounded men to safety through enemy lines, once for holding a position against overwhelming odds until reinforcements arrived. The army had called him a hero, though he'd never felt like one. He'd just done what needed doing, survived when others hadn't, made hard choices in impossible situations. Now he'd have to do it again. But this time the stakes were even higher. This time he wasn't fighting for abstract concepts like duty or country. He was fighting for Emma, for the life they were building together, for the future they deserved. "Tell me about your time in the army," Emma said, coming to stand beside him. She'd been watching from the doorway, had seen him lost in memory, so Jacob told her. About cold nights on watch, about tracking hostile bands through impossible terrain, about the friends he'd lost and the ones he'd saved, about learning that survival often came down to preparation and will, being ready for the worst and refusing to quit, even when quitting seemed like the only sane option. "You've been preparing for this your whole adult life," Emma observed. "All those skills, all that experience, it's like everything led you here, to this moment." "Maybe," Jacob said. "Or maybe I'm just a stubborn man who's found something worth being stubborn about." Emma smiled and kissed him softly. "I love your stubbornness." "Good, because you're stuck with it." Jacob pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. "Emma, whatever happens in the next few days, whatever we have to do, I want you to know something. These weeks with you, building this, falling in love with you, they've been the happiest of my life since I lost Margaret and Sarah. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever. You gave me the same gift," Emma whispered. "You taught me I could stop running, could trust someone, could build a life instead of just surviving day to day." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight, drawing strength from their connection. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the mountains stood sentinel against the stars. Inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds, prepared to defend what they'd built, knowing that soon the test would come. On the 14th day after receiving the marshal's letter, Jacob woke just before dawn to a sound that made his blood run cold. Horses, multiple horses moving carefully up the trail toward the homestead. He was out of bed in seconds, rifle in hand, moving to wake Emma. "They're here," he said quietly. "Get dressed, quickly. Stay low and remember everything we practiced." Emma's face was pale but determined. She nodded, reaching for her clothes with steady hands. The siege was about to begin. The first light of dawn revealed 4 riders approaching the homestead at a deliberate pace, spread out in a formation that spoke of military training or professional experience. Jacob watched them from the cabin's reinforced firing port, his rifle steady, his mind cataloguing every detail. 3 men and 1 woman, all well-dressed for the frontier, all carrying themselves with the confidence of people who'd done this before. The lead rider was a tall man in his 40s, with silver threading through dark hair, his expensive coat unable to hide the pistol belt underneath. Behind him rode 2 younger men, hard-faced and alert, their hands resting casually near their weapons. The woman brought up the rear, her riding dress practical but fine, her eyes scanning the homestead with calculating precision. They stopped 50 yards out, well beyond pistol range, but close enough for conversation. The leader raised one hand in a gesture of peace, then called out in a voice that carried clearly in the cold morning air, "Mr. Thornhill, Miss Dawson. My name is Marcus Webb. I represent Mr. Vincent Carmichael of Boston. We're here to discuss a business matter." Jacob said nothing, just kept his rifle trained on Webb's chest. Beside him, Emma had taken position at the second firing port, Mrs. Henderson's pistol gripped in both hands. "We're not looking for trouble," Webb continued when no answer came. "Mr. Carmichael simply wishes to speak with Miss Dawson, to clarify certain misunderstandings regarding her testimony in his recent legal difficulties. He's prepared to offer substantial compensation for her time. Tell Carmichael that Emma Dawson has nothing to say to him," Jacob called back. "And you're trespassing on private property. Turn around and ride back the way you came." Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable, Mr. Thornhill. Mr. Carmichael has invested considerable resources in locating Miss Dawson, and he won't be denied this conversation. However, he recognizes you've been drawn into this situation through no fault of your own. Leave now with $1,000 for your trouble, and we'll conclude our business with Miss Dawson privately." "She's not going anywhere with you," Jacob said flatly. "Then you're choosing to involve yourself in matters that will end badly for you," Webb replied, his voice hardening. Mr. Thornhill, I know your history. Former Army scout, competent with weapons, clearly a capable man. But you're facing 4 trained professionals backed by unlimited resources. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. Be reasonable, Emma spoke then, her voice clear and strong despite the tremor Jacob could feel running through her. Mr. Webb, I testified truthfully about what I witnessed. Vincent Carmichael murdered Robert Hayes in cold blood, and I won't recant that testimony no matter what threats or bribes you offer. Leave now, or the law will hear about this attempted intimidation. Webb's expression turned cold. Miss Dawson, the law has proven remarkably flexible where Mr. Carmichael's interests are concerned. As for your testimony, he reached into his coat and pulled out a sheaf of papers. These are the original trial documents. All Mr. Carmichael requires is for you to sign a statement indicating you were mistaken in your identification, that the stress of witnessing violence clouded your judgment. Do this, and he's prepared to offer you $10,000 and safe passage to anywhere in the country. And if I refuse, then Mr. Carmichael will be forced to take steps to ensure you can never testify against him again. Webb's meaning was clear. This is your final opportunity to resolve this peacefully. Emma's not signing anything, Jacob said. And you've got about 10 seconds to turn those horses around before I start shooting, Webb sighed, as though disappointed by their lack of cooperation. Very well. I tried to offer you a civilized solution. He turned in his saddle, gesturing to his companions. Gentlemen, Miss Reeves, you know what to do. The 4 riders wheeled their horses and rode back down the trail at an easy canter, disappearing into the trees. But Jacob knew they weren't leaving. This was just the opening move, the civilized veneer, before the real violence began. They'll be back, Emma said, lowering her pistol with shaking hands. Within the hour, Jacob agreed. They wanted to see our defenses, see if we'd panic or negotiate. Now they know we're prepared to fight. He moved to the window facing east, scanning the tree line. They'll spread out, try to surround us, cut off any escape routes. Then they'll either try to burn us out or wait for darkness to move in close. Jacob, those papers Webb showed, they looked official. What if Carmichael really can make the law look the other way? Then the law's broken, and we fix what we can fix. Jacob turned to her, his expression serious. Emma, I need you to do something for me. I need you to write down everything, your testimony, what you saw that night, names and dates and details. If something happens to us, if we don't make it through this, that document needs to survive, needs to reach people who'll use it. You think we're going to die? Emma said quietly. I think we're facing trained killers, backed by a wealthy man who has every reason to want you dead, Jacob replied honestly. But I also think we've got advantages they don't expect. Home ground preparation and the element of surprise. They think they're hunting frightened prey. They don't know they're walking into a trap. Emma nodded slowly, then crossed to him, rising on her toes to kiss him firmly. Then let's spring it. Outside the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the pristine snow. Somewhere in the trees, 4 killers were preparing their assault. And in the cabin, 2 people who'd found unexpected love in the wilderness, prepared to fight for the right to keep it. The attack came 2 hours later, just as Jacob predicted. The woman, Miss Reeves, appeared first on the eastern approach, moving through the trees with practiced stealth. She was trying to flank the cabin, get to a position where she could provide covering fire for the others. Jacob had anticipated this. He'd spent days studying every approach, every piece of cover, every angle of attack. He knew exactly where she'd emerge from the tree line, and he was ready. When Reeves broke from cover, making a dash toward a fallen log that would give her a clear shot at the cabin's side, Jacob fired. The shot was deliberate, aimed to wound rather than kill. He clipped her left leg, sending her tumbling into the snow with a cry of pain. She tried to crawl toward cover, but another shot from Jacob kicked up snow inches from her head, and she went still, hands raised in surrender. "Stay down and you live," Jacob called out. "Move and the next one goes through your skull." The message was clear, and it had the desired effect. The other 3 attackers now knew they weren't facing an amateur. Someone out here knew exactly what they were doing. Webb's voice came from the trees to the south. "Impressive shooting, Mr. Thornhill, but you can't watch all directions at once." He was right, and they both knew it. This was why Jacob had spent so much time preparing firing positions, creating overlapping fields of view. Emma had taken up position in the barn, covering the western approach, while Jacob held the cabin. The two younger men tried to rush the cabin from different angles, using suppressing fire to keep Jacob pinned. But Emma, steady and focused despite the terror Jacob knew she must be feeling, opened fire from the barn. Her first shot missed, but the second caught one of the men in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him to the ground. The other man, seeing his companion fall, broke off his attack and retreated to the tree line. "Two down, two still active. Better odds, but still dangerous. You're only making this worse," Webb called out. "Surrender, Miss Dawson, now, and I give you my word you'll be allowed to live." "Your word's worth less than spit," Jacob replied. He was moving between firing ports, never staying in one place long enough to present a target. "You came here to murder a witness. You think I believe you'll let me live after?" A long silence, then Webb tried a different approach. "Mr. Thornhill, be reasonable. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and alone out here. Even if you survive today, Carmichael will send more men. And more after that. He has infinite resources and infinite patience. You cannot win this." Jacob didn't answer, but his mind was working furiously. Webb was right about the long term. They couldn't hold out indefinitely against a wealthy man's vengeance. But if they could survive this immediate threat, get testimony and evidence to the federal marshal, force another trial, that might be enough to put Carmichael away permanently, make him too visible and vulnerable to continue his campaign of intimidation. The afternoon wore on in a deadly stalemate. The wounded attackers, Reeves with her leg injury and the young man Emma had shot, lay in the snow, slowly bleeding, slowly weakening. Webb and his remaining companion were pinned down, unable to advance without exposing themselves to fire from both the cabin and barn. Jacob knew Webb was waiting for darkness, when the advantage would shift. In the dark, trained killers could move unseen, could get close enough to set fire to the buildings or breach the defenses. They had perhaps 4 hours until sunset. Then something unexpected happened. The sound of horses coming fast up the trail from town. Multiple riders moving with purpose. Jacob felt his heart leap. Had the sheriff gotten word somehow? Had help arrived? Webb heard it too. Jacob saw him signal his companion, saw them melt back into the trees. Whatever was coming, Webb wanted to see it before committing to action. A dozen riders appeared, led by Sheriff Crenshaw and including Doc Harlan. Several townsmen Jacob recognized, and his breath caught. Marshal William Garrett himself, the federal officer who'd written the warning letter. The marshal rode straight toward where Webb's people lay wounded, his badge visible on his coat. "Marcus Webb," he called out, his voice carrying authority. "You and your associates are under arrest for attempted murder, witness intimidation, and violation of federal law. Come out now with your hands visible, or I'll authorize deadly force." There was a long, tense moment. Then Webb emerged from the trees, hands raised, his companion following. The fight had gone out of them. Facing local law was one thing, but a federal marshal with a dozen armed deputies was another matter entirely. Jacob watched from the cabin as Crenshaw's men disarmed and bound the 4 attackers, as Doc Harlan tended to their wounds. The marshal rode up to the cabin, dismounting and approaching with his hands visible in a gesture of peace. "Mr. Thornhill, Miss Dawson," he called. "It's over. You can come out now. You're safe." Jacob looked at Emma, saw the tears streaming down her face, the relief and disbelief warring in her expression. They'd survived. Against all odds, against professional killers backed by unlimited money, they'd held out long enough for help to arrive. He took her hand, and together they walked out into the fading afternoon light, into a future that suddenly seemed possible again. 3 months later, early spring came to the Wyoming mountains with the gentle insistence of new life. The snow melted in patches, revealing green grass underneath, and the aspens began to show the first hints of leaves. Emma stood on the newly expanded porch of the homestead, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. Watching Jacob work in what would soon be a proper garden, so much had changed since that terrible afternoon when Webb and his killers had come for her. The marshal had taken them into custody, along with detailed statements from both Emma and Jacob about the attack and Carmichael's campaign of intimidation. The federal case had been reopened, this time with additional charges that made it impossible for Carmichael's lawyers to find technical loopholes. He was back in prison, this time with a sentence that would keep him there for the rest of his natural life. The attackers had talked, as criminals often did when facing lengthy prison terms themselves. They'd given testimony about Carmichael's organization, about other murders and crimes, about a network of corruption that reached higher than anyone had suspected. The case had become a sensation in the Eastern papers, and Emma's courage in testifying, twice now despite threats and violence, had made her something of an unlikely hero. But she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who'd survived, who'd been given a second chance at happiness, and who was determined not to waste it. Doc Harlan had confirmed the pregnancy a month after the attack. Emma was perhaps 3 months along, the baby conceived during those precious days before Webb arrived, when she and Jacob had finally stopped fighting their feelings and allowed themselves to love completely. The news had terrified them both initially. Bringing a child into their dangerous situation seemed impossibly reckless. But now, with the threat ended and the future secure, it felt like a blessing. Jacob looked up from his work, saw her watching, and smiled. The transformation in him over these months had been remarkable. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes for so long had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, and walked to the porch. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, but his tone was gentle, teasing. "I've been resting for 3 months," Emma replied. "If I rest any more, I'll take root like one of your vegetables." Jacob laughed and pulled her close, his hand joining hers on her belly. "How's she doing today?" "She? You're convinced it's a girl?" "I am," Jacob said firmly. "And she's going to be just like her mother, stubborn, brave, and beautiful." Emma leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the safety that still sometimes surprised her with its simple reality. "I was thinking we should name her Sarah if it is a girl, after your daughter." Jacob went very still, and when Emma looked up, she saw tears in his eyes. "Emma, you don't have to—" "I want to," she interrupted gently. "Jacob, Sarah was part of your life, part of who you are. I'm not trying to replace her or Margaret, but I'd like to honor them, to carry their memory forward with us. If you're comfortable with that." "I'd like that," Jacob whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd like that very much." They stood like that for a while, holding each other in the spring sunshine, both marveling at how far they'd come from that cold November evening, when Emma had walked through the door, with her hand broken and her spirit unbowed. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Sheriff Crenshaw rode up the trail, accompanied by a wagon driven by Mrs. Henderson. The old woman had become a regular visitor, bringing supplies and gossip from town, treating Emma like the granddaughter she'd never had. "Afternoon, you two," Crenshaw called out, dismounting. "Brought some news from the telegraph office. Thought you'd want to hear it right away." He handed Jacob a telegram, official and brief. Carmichael's appeal had been denied. His sentence was final. The case was closed. "It's over," Emma breathed, reading over Jacob's shoulder. "Really, truly over. Looks that way," Crenshaw agreed. Carmichael's lawyers tried every trick they knew, but the evidence was too solid. "He'll die in prison, and good riddance to him." Mrs. Henderson climbed down from the wagon, moving with the careful dignity of her years. "I brought wedding presents," she announced, gesturing to the covered items in the wagon bed. "Since you two finally made it official last month, figured you deserved a proper celebration." The wedding had been a quiet affair at the cabin, with Doc Harlan officiating and a handful of trusted friends in attendance. Emma wore a simple dress that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, letting out the waist to accommodate her changing figure. Jacob wore his best shirt and the vest that held his father's watch. They'd exchanged vows on the porch at sunset, promising to love and honor each other for whatever time they were given. It hadn't been fancy or elaborate, but it had been perfect. Everything they needed and nothing they didn't, just like the life they were building together. Over the next hour, they unwrapped Mrs. Henderson's gifts. A cradle that the town carpenter had made, beautifully crafted from pine and sanded smooth as silk. A quilt pieced together by several of the town's women, each square containing a different pattern and story. Baby clothes and blankets, practical items born of genuine affection and community support. "The town's behind you," Sheriff Crenshaw said as they admired the gifts. "Folks heard what you did, standing up to those killers, protecting Emma. Made them proud to know you, Jacob. And Emma," he turned to her, "your courage in testifying, even when it put your life at risk, that's the kind of integrity this territory needs. You're both welcome in Timber Creek anytime." After they left, promising to return for the baby's birth, Emma and Jacob carried the gifts inside, arranging them in the small room they'd prepared as a nursery. The cradle fit perfectly in the corner, where afternoon light would fall warm and golden. Sarah's old rag doll sat on a shelf nearby, a bridge between past and future, grief and joy. "Do you ever wonder how different things might have been?" Emma asked as they stood looking at the nursery. "If I hadn't come here, if you hadn't taken that advertisement for a cook, if everything hadn't happened exactly as it did." "Every day," Jacob admitted. "And every day I'm grateful it happened exactly this way. Emma, you saved my life. Not from those killers, from myself. From the isolation I'd built around my heart. You reminded me what it means to live, not just survive." "We saved each other," Emma corrected. "You gave me a home when I was running. Gave me safety when I was afraid. Gave me love when I'd stopped believing in it." She took his hand, placed it on her belly. "And now we're giving each other this, a future, a family. A chance to build something good from all the broken pieces." That evening, as the sun set over the mountains in shades of gold and rose, they sat together on the porch. Jacob had carved a new sign for the homestead, Thornhill and Dawson, and it swung gently in the spring breeze. The valley below was coming alive with new growth, and in the distance they could see the lights of Timber Creek beginning to glow as lamps were lit against the gathering dusk. Emma leaned against Jacob's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid presence that had become her anchor. In her pocket, she carried her mother's recipe book, its pages worn from use but still legible. Tonight she'd make bread using her mother's recipe, and tomorrow they'd share it with neighbors, continuing the cycle of connection and community that transformed a house into a home. Jacob pulled out his father's watch, opening it to check the time. The mechanism ticked steadily, keeping perfect time now, marking the moments of a life that was moving forward instead of standing still. Inside, he'd added a new photograph, one of Emma on their wedding day, her smile radiant despite the simple setting, her eyes full of love and hope. "Do you remember what you asked me that first night?" Emma said quietly. "When you were cleaning my wounds, and I told you they'd broken my hand, but I'd keep working." "I remember everything about that night," Jacob replied. "You asked what kind of woman refuses to break, even when her bones do," Emma continued. "I thought about that question a lot these past months, and I think I finally have an answer." "What's that?" "The kind of woman who has something worth fighting for. The kind who knows that giving up isn't the same as losing, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep standing, keep trying, keep believing that tomorrow might be better than today." She turned to look at him. "You taught me that, Jacob. You showed me what it means to survive the worst and still choose to live fully, to love deeply, to hope courageously." Jacob pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We taught each other," he said. "That's what love does. It makes us braver than we thought we could be, stronger than we knew we were, and more hopeful than circumstances suggest we should be." As darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one above the mountains, they remained on the porch, wrapped in shared warmth and shared dreams. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight, a beacon in the wilderness. Inside, the cradle waited for new life. The table stood ready for shared meals. The hearth held fire that would keep them warm through whatever winters came. They'd both learned hard lessons about loss, about fear, about the terrible fragility of the things we love. But they'd also learned something more important, that broken things can be mended, that wounded hearts can heal, that courage sometimes looks like a quiet woman refusing to let pain steal her dignity, or a grieving man choosing to love again despite the risk. In the distance, a wolf howled, and Jacob instinctively tightened his arm around Emma, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced worse than wolves and survived. They both had. And whatever challenges lay ahead, the birth of their child, the changing seasons, the inevitable trials that come with building a life, they'd face them the same way. They'd faced everything else together. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who keep going when they have every reason to quit. Sometimes courage looks like choosing connection over isolation, hope over despair, love over fear. And sometimes the most extraordinary lives are built not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet determination to keep working, keep believing, keep choosing to live fully even when your hands are broken and your heart is scared. This is their story, a story of resilience and redemption, of second chances and hard-won hope. A story that began with violence but ended with grace, that started in fear but finished in love. A story that proves, in the end, that the human spirit is more resilient than we know, and that sometimes the best way to heal a broken hand is to reach for another person's and refuse to let go.